Hey guys, welcome to your next lecture. Today we're going to be talking about something called subject and predicate. And there's a reason why I had you do nouns and pronouns first, because I think it's going to help you move through this lecture a little easier. I also posted this video in Canvas for you to watch because even though it's a quick little illustration, a quick little cartoon, it will definitely make this lecture a lot easier for you. So we started off our syntax when we went into nouns. We started off that conversation with what is the goal of syntax, and the goal of syntax is to discuss why something is grammatical and why something is not grammatical. So I gave you these three not grammatical sentences, and we're not going to address these three sentences today, but it's just to illustrate that you, as a speaker of the language, read these sentences and know that something is wrong. And partially what is wrong is that the word order is off, right? And we know in every language, word order is important for successful communication. The order of the words in our sentence or our clauses is very important. Word order can change meaning. So whatever order I put the words in my clause or my sentence can change how you interpret that meaning. So I can say the cat killed the mouse, or I can say the mouse killed the cat. And there I've changed the word order, but the meaning of the sentence is completely different. Same with Alex ate cereal or cereal ate Alex. Word order can change meaning. Word order can impact meaning. It can prevent understanding. The book is on the table. If someone were to say, table thee on his book, you'd be like, what? I don't understand what you're saying. Because the meaning is lost because the word order is messed up. Alex ate cereal. I could say ate cereal Alex. And again, you might not be able to understand what I'm saying, or you're going to have to think for a long time to understand what I'm saying because my word order is off. I want to mention right here that there's a difference between unintelligible speech and non-fluent speech. So the first example I gave you, table thee on his book, would be a decent example of unintelligible speech. Someone might say that to you. I don't know who would, but if someone said that, you would be like, what? I do not know what you're saying. Come again. Say again. First, the second example, ate cereal Alex, which even though the word order is also off, you might still be able to generate some level of meaning. So we would call this second example non-fluent speech because the meaning might still be there if I think on it, but because of the word order, I have to think a little harder on it. The first one, though, we would say unintelligible speech, meaning when I would hear someone say that, I have no clue what they're getting at. But nonetheless, both of these were just to illustrate that word order can impact or prevent someone from understanding the meaning. So word order can change meaning and word order can impact meaning. What this leads us to is the point that word order is fixed. There are rules to our sentence structures. And I want to investigate this by looking at the example of the ungrammatical sentence, ate cereal Alex. So we want to think about, because we're in syntax, right, where words are and what type of words are we dealing with. So we want to discuss parts of speech. So here I have our ungrammatical sentence, ate cereal Alex, and all of you could quickly correct this and rewrite it as Alex ate cereal. And then if I look at the parts of speech, I see Alex is a noun, ate is a verb, and cereal is also a noun. So I want to investigate where words are, but I also want to look at why they are in this order, okay? Why is it not cereal Alex ate or cereal ate Alex? And this is because in English, or what we're investigating with English, is we are a subject predicate language, okay? Now, if you watch that short video, you're thinking, Mr. Morton is the subject of the sentence, and what the predicate says, he does. That probably is making this very clear to you very quickly. Alex is the subject of the sentence, and the predicate is everything Alex does. So Alex is the subject, the predicate is Alex ate cereal. When we look at our nonsense, our ungrammatical example, ate cereal Alex, we notice that it's actually backwards. And that's why that's not a grammatical English sentence, because we're somehow putting the predicate, ate cereal, before the subject. And English is a subject predicate language. The subject must come first. Let's look at some examples. The cat killed the mouse. The subject, I just told you, has to come first. So the subject is the cat. The predicate is everything the subject does, which is killed the mouse. My professor recorded the lectures. The subject is my professor, and the predicate is everything that the professor does. The predicate is that the professor recorded the lectures. So these are some simple sentences, right? These are simple English sentences, and it's pretty easy to identify the subject and the predicate. Again, especially if you watched that little cartoon I posted for you. But let's look at another example. Let's look at a sentence that's a little more long-winded and not a short, simple sentence. We used this example sentence when we looked at relative pronouns in the last lecture. The woman who called yesterday wants to buy the house. Now, I just told you English is a subject predicate language, okay? So how does that apply to this sentence that I gave you? The woman who called yesterday wants to buy the house. Well, it still does. But what we need to think about is we need to think about how this is not just a sentence. This is a sentence with two clauses in it. There are two clauses in this sentence. The first is the woman wants to buy the house. And the second clause is who called yesterday. So when we're looking at everything from here forward, I want us to think about in this clause, there's a subject and predicate, rather than thinking about in this sentence, there's a subject and predicate. Because sometimes, as you know, as being speakers of the language, all of our sentences aren't short things. When we utter sentences or write sentences, they have lots of parts to it, but they all still obey the subject predicate rule. So let's look at this example sentence. The woman who called yesterday wants to buy the house, and figure out how it fits our subject predicate rules. Well, we have two clauses. The first clause was the woman wants to buy the house. So my subject there is the woman, and the predicate is everything the woman does. The woman wants to buy the house. But inside this clause, I have another clause, who called yesterday, which again is made up of a subject, who, and the predicate called yesterday. Now, who is a relative pronoun, and it's pointing back to the noun, the woman. So if you need a refresher on that, you can go back to nouns and pronouns. But this is why I started with nouns and pronouns first, because you needed to be able to identify those first in order to then go into talking about, well, what's the subject of a sentence? What makes up the subject? So what is the subject? Here are several sentences we've now looked at. Alex ate cereal. The cat killed the mouse. My professor recorded the lectures, and the woman who called yesterday wants to buy the house. If you look at our subjects, I've isolated them for you. So subject of the first sentence is Alex. Subject of the second sentence is the cat, and so forth. What does this have in common? What rule can we deduce from the subject examples that we see here? Well, to answer that question, you would want to think, well, what part of speech are these words, right? So Alex is a noun. The cat is an article plus noun. My professor is a possessive adjective, so an adjective plus noun. The woman is an article plus noun, and who is an who called yesterday, that one sentence, that one clause, is a pronoun. So when I ask you, what is the subject? When I'm talking about a subject, what is it? Well, the subject is always a noun or pronoun plus other items describing it. Okay, so go back up to my professor. My professor. That's a possessive adjective and a noun. Okay, so the subject is my professor. It's the noun plus all the things that are describing it. Same with the woman. The subject is woman, but it's also the, because the is describing woman, right? So article plus noun. The woman is the subject of the sentence, not just woman. But let's talk about what makes the predicate now. So we know the subject is always a noun or a pronoun, and that it and everything else that describes it in that little phrase, right? So my hairy professor. I am not hairy. That was a spur of the moment example that really was stupid. Okay, but even then, my hairy professor is the subject, right? It's not just professor. So what is the predicate? Well, I've isolated our predicates for you. Ate cereal, killed the mouse, recorded the lectures. wants to buy the house, called yesterday. And what rules could you think of now that you're looking at these examples? What parts of speech are these? Is there a rule about the predicate in English that we can glean from these parts of speech? And the answer is yes. Ate cereal, verb plus noun. Killed the mouse, verb plus article plus noun. Recorded the lectures, verb plus article plus noun. Wants to buy the house, verb plus preposition plus verb plus article plus noun. You might not know what prepositions are, and that's okay. That's going to come next week. But I'm just illustrating this for you. The last one is verb plus adverb. Okay, so what can we deduce about rules regarding the predicate in English? Well, in English, and there's a reason I've circled that, the predicate is always the verb plus everything after it. Okay, and you'll see there I have in parentheses the main verb. If you go to our example, wants to buy the house. So the full sentence was the woman wants to buy the house. We actually have multiple verbs in that sentence, but one is the main verb. And we're going to do a lecture on verbs next week. So I'm just illustrating for you. It's the main verb, so usually the first verb in the sentence plus everything after. And there's a reason I circled in English. The first thing I want to say, though, is that 87% of languages in the world are subject-predicate languages. So what that's saying to you is there's 13% of languages out there that don't go subject-predicate. And we're going to look at an example of that in a second. But 87% of the languages in the world are subject-predicate, meaning the subject of the sentence is the first thing that they say. Now, examples would be English, Spanish, and Chinese. We are all subject predicate languages. And by Chinese, I mean probably Cantonese or Mandarin, right? They're both subject predicate. But here is why I circled in English on the last slide. And this also applies to Spanish, but I'm going to use English as our primary language for instruction. Only 42% of languages follow the subject predicate formula, where the subject is a noun or a pronoun and the predicate is a verb plus everything else. That means other languages are doing other things. Only 42% are like English and Spanish that do subject, noun or pronoun, plus the predicate, which always starts with the verb. So let's look at how this looks in English. English is a subject-predicate language, but if we look closely at our predicate starts with the verb and might follow with some other things. So we call that an object, okay? And I have object in parentheses because there might not be an object. And I give an example at the bottom. Alex ate cereal, subject, verb, object, perfect. The cat killed the mouse, subject, verb, object, awesome. My professor recorded the lecture, subject, verb, object, awesome. The cow jumped. Now, the cow jumped has a subject and verb, but it doesn't have an object, and that's okay. Not every sentence or clause in English has an object. What I'm illustrating here, though, is that the cow jumped still follows our subject-predicate rule. The subject is the cow, and jumped is the predicate. It doesn't matter whether or not the cow jumped somewhere specific. It's just that jumped is a verb, and it's our predicate. So English is a subject-verb object language. We don't always have to have an object, but we can. We can have a subject-verb object language. However, this is where it gets interesting. Not all languages are subject-verb object. So let's start with an English example first. I saw him or her, okay? Subject, verb, object. That obeys all of our English rules. But let's look at the Turkish language now. Ben onu gördüm. That actually is the subject of the sentence is been. So if you were going to do a translation, the English pronoun I can be translated as been in Turkish, okay? The object of the English sentence is him or her, and it's at the very end. But if you look at Turkish, the object is actually right after the subject. So if I took that Turkish sentence and I translated it into English in the exact order that it is, it would say, I, him, saw, or I, her, saw, okay? Because Turkish is also a subject-predicate language, right? Subject, been, and then after that is a predicate. But their predicate is not verb plus object like English. It's object plus verb. They are an SOV language. English is an SVO languages. Both languages, again, are subject predicate, but in Turkish, the object precedes the verb. And this is good to know because there's actually a variety of sentence structures in the languages all around the world. English, Spanish, we're subject, verb, object. Turkish is subject, object, verb. And then there's very few languages that have verb, subject, object. So that would be like, what was our example there? I saw him. So verb, subject, object would be saw I him. Or verb, object, subject would be saw him I. Object, verb, subject would be him, saw I, right? And now in English, that means completely different things, right? Him saw I versus I saw him has different meaning. So for you to guess real quick, of roughly 6,500 known languages in the world, which sentence structure above do you think is the most dominant? And I'm going to show you the slides, so go ahead and think of what your answer is. Based on all these sentence structures, which one is the most dominant or prevalent amongst all the languages? And to our surprise, it's not the English one. It's subject, object, verb. So what you just saw with Turkish is actually the most dominant language structure amongst the languages in the world. So that's important to know, and here's why this is also important to know. Is that we always want to talk about how does this impact our students' learning, right? So you have, let's say your student is Turkish, she's from Turkey, she speaks Turkish, and she's going to learn English now, or she's going to learn Spanish, and that is going to impact her Turkish language may impact her conceptualization of English syntax because she comes from a subject, object, verb language. And when she's learning a subject, verb, object language, she might inverse those to still follow the rules of a subject, object, verb language, just like her Turkish language. And we call this negative transfer. And we've talked about this term before, but when your first language negatively impacts your acquisition of the second language, that's called negative transfer. But we need to discuss this because as I'm showing you on this screen, the subject, verb, object arrangement that English has and Spanish has is not the most prevalent in the world. Okay, now there's a lot of English speakers and a lot of Spanish speakers, so we might have more speakers than compared to people who speak Turkish. But in terms of all the different types of languages out there, we're not necessarily the number one sentence structure type. So English, as I said, is a subject, verb, object language. And we can still conceptualize this as subject predicate, but we now are discussing how the predicate is different amongst different languages. In English, the predicate is verb plus maybe an object. So what I want to show you here, though, is again to stress this idea that the subject is not just a noun and pronoun. It's all those things that describe it. And same with the verb and same with the object. So originally we had the sentence, the cat killed the mouse. But if I have the sentence, the furry cat instantly killed the tiny mouse, I am still obeying the subject predicate or the subject verb object rules. All I've done is add some additional parts of speech to my sentence, but I'm still following the rule. And so one thing you need to be thinking about as we move forward is parts of speech, and you'll learn more about adjectives and adverbs next. But I added the adjective furry, so the furry cat. I added the adverb instantly killed, and I added tiny, so the tiny mouse. So if I were to ask you regarding that first example, what is the subject of the sentence? The subject, of the sentence is the furry cat. It's not just cat, it's the furry cat. All of that is the subject. The noun or the pronoun and everything that describes it is part of the subject. Now, we do, on occasion, have some clauses or phrases or sentences, whatever you want to call it in English, that are only verb object. So there is no subject, okay? And those are a small class of types of speech which are basically commands. If you think about it, if I say sit down, there's no subject in that sentence. If I say get out, there's no subject in that sentence. There's only a predicate, right? Sit down, get out. But even though we're omitting the subject, you have to think about the fact that there's still a subject receiving that action, right? Even though I don't say to you, you sit down or you get out, you're still the subject of what I'm saying. I'm just omitting you from speech. So really, there's only a few instances where you ever come across sentences in English that don't have a subject, but you have to understand the subject is still implied, even though I'm not saying you sit down and using the subject pronoun you. Even though I'm not using it verbally, it's still there. It's still implied. I want to quickly show you an error I came across with a student one time, and the student had said, my English professor, she is very smart. And I want to use this real quick while I wrap up our lecture here just to show you how some of these subject predicate errors occur. And so my English professor, she is very smart. If we were to look at that and figure out what the subject is, well, the subject is my English professor, but then we have another subject, which is she. So right now, the rule we have is that the subject is always a noun or a pronoun, right? But here, this student has used both. And so the error that we're seeing in this example is the repeated subject. The subject predicate formula only calls for one subject, and this student has used two. So that's the type of error this is. I also wanted to quickly address subject, predicate, and question. So here next, you're going to take quiz 7. And in order to be prepared for that, I wanted to throw one more tangent of information at you, which was how would I discover the subject and the predicate in questions, right? So we have the question, has he arrived? And everything we've looked at so far has told you that the subject is always the beginning of the sentence. Well, that's not the case in questions, okay? Has he arrived? The subject of that question is not has. Okay, in order to figure out the subject, you want to unravel the question into a statement. So I can take has he arrived and change it to he has arrived. And now if I were to ask you to find the subject of he has arrived, you would be able to find it as he, the pronoun he, because that follows all of the other tips I've given you that the subject is the beginning. The next question, were you going to the store? Were you going to go to the store? You could unravel that question into a statement. You were going to go to the store. And then we would find that you is our subject. Last question. When did that big hairy dog get in? The big hairy dog got in. And so our subject is the big hairy dog. I'm not going to spend time just yet on how we make questions in English. If we get time this semester, I'll give you information on that. Otherwise, I do know you learn more about that in Linguistics 4030. So obviously, when you look at that last example, when did that big hairy dog get in? When we made it a statement, we took off the word when, right? We took off the pronoun when. And we also changed the verb from get to got. So there's other things happening there. But that's not necessary, and that's subject-verb agreement, right? And we'll get there if we can, but the main thing I want you to think about is how do I find the subject of a question? Well, you need to take that question and you need to make it a statement. So again, like I just said, this ends our lecture. I want you to go to quiz 7, where you're going to take your capstone quiz on review of nouns and pronouns, and subject and predicate. So this whole lecture right here, I am going to throw in some more questions about nouns and pronouns. You did exercises on that earlier, but there'll be a couple more questions regarding that. And then a majority of the questions focusing on subject predicate. All right, guys, that's all I had for you. Talk to you later.